My stepchildren threw me out after their father's funeral, but they had no idea what he really left me. I never thought I'd be writing this story, but after everything that happened, I need to tell someone. Maybe it will help another woman who finds herself in the same position I was in. Just 6 months ago, my name is Elena, and until recently, I thought my life was over. When I married Richard at 42, his 3 children made it clear I wasn't welcome. Sarah was 26, Michael was 24, and Jessica was 21. To them, I wasn't their father's wife, I was the gold digger who had stolen their inheritance. Richard was 61 when we met at a charity gala. He was distinguished, successful, and surprisingly lonely despite his wealth. His first wife, Margaret, had passed away 5 years earlier from cancer, and his children had been his entire world since then. When he introduced me to them 6 months into our relationship, the temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. "She is young enough to be your daughter, Dad," Sarah said coldly during our first family dinner. "I am 42," I replied gently. "Hardly a child." "Still 20 years younger," Michael added, not even looking at me. "Mom was the same age as Dad," she understood him. Richard squeezed my hand under the table. "Elena makes me happy," he said firmly. "That should matter to you." But it didn't matter to them, not then, and certainly not during our 4 years of marriage. They made their disapproval known, in countless small ways. Sarah would call during our dinner dates claiming emergencies that never materialized. Michael would show up unannounced at our home, walking in like he still lived there. Jessica would post old photos of her parents on social media, accompanied by captions about real love and irreplaceable bonds. Richard tried to bridge the gap, but I could see how much their rejection wore on him. He was a man who had built his success on bringing people together. He'd made his fortune in mergers and acquisitions, but he couldn't merge his old life with his new one. "Give them time," he would tell me. "They're still grieving their mother." I gave them 4 years of ignored birthday gifts, of being excluded from family photos, of listening to them talk about their mother's perfection at every gathering. I smiled through it all because I loved Richard. And because I naively believed that love would eventually win them over. I was wrong. Richard had his first heart attack on a Tuesday. I was at my book club when the call came from his office. By the time I reached the hospital, Sarah, Michael and Jessica were already there, clustered around his bedside like protective wolves. "Where were you?" Sarah demanded as I approached. "He was asking for family." "I am his wife," I said quietly. "You are his second choice," Jessica snapped. "Mom was his family. We're his family." Richard recovered from that first attack, but something changed in him. He became more introspective, spending long hours in his study, working on what he called getting his affairs in order. He asked me to give him space during these sessions, and though it hurt, I respected his wishes. "I need to make sure everyone is taken care of," he explained one evening, as we sat on our terrace overlooking the garden. "I need to be fair to everyone I love." "I don't need anything, Richard," I told him, taking his hand. "I just need you." He smiled sadly. "That is why I love you, Elena. You never asked for anything." The second heart attack came 3 months later. This time, there was no recovery. The funeral was torture. Sarah took charge of all the arrangements, making decisions without consulting me. I sat in the front pew alone, while the 3 of them sat together across the aisle, accepting condolences as the real family. Several people assumed I was a family friend or distant relative. During the eulogy, Michael spoke about his father's devotion to his late mother and his pride in his children. He mentioned Richard's dedication to family values and his unwavering commitment to those who mattered most. I wasn't mentioned once. After the service, as guests mingled in the funeral home's reception area, I overheard Sarah talking to her aunt. "Finally, we can get Dad's affairs settled properly," she was saying. "Elena will be taken care of course. Dad wasn't heartless, but the bulk of everything will come back to family where it belongs." That evening, as I sat alone in the house Richard and I had shared, I felt smaller than I ever had in my life. Everything around me, the furniture he'd chosen, the artwork we'd bought together, even the garden we'd planned, felt borrowed, temporary, like I'd been playing house for 4 years, and now it was time to go back to real life. The reading of the will was scheduled for the following Friday. I debated not attending. What was the point? I knew what Richard's children expected, and honestly, part of me just wanted to disappear. I could go back to my small apartment, my quiet life, and try to forget that I'd ever been part of this family that never wanted me. But something Richard had said kept echoing in my mind: "You never asked for anything." Maybe it was time to at least show up and see what small consideration he'd made for his unwelcome second wife. The law office was intimidating, all dark wood and leather bound books. Robert Caldwell, Richard's longtime attorney, was a distinguished man in his 70s who had handled the family's affairs for decades. He greeted me politely but distantly, the way people treat peripheral figures at important events. Sarah, Michael, and Jessica arrived together, dressed in expensive black suits that somehow managed to look both mournful and triumphant. They took seats at the large conference table, leaving an empty chair between them and me. Even in this, they maintained their distance. "Before we begin," Mr. Caldwell said, adjusting his glasses, "I want to say that Richard was very thoughtful in his planning. He spent considerable time over the past months, ensuring that his wishes were clearly documented." Sarah leaned forward eagerly. "He always was meticulous about details." Indeed, Mr. Caldwell opened a thick folder. "The will is quite comprehensive, so please bear with me as we go through each provision." He began with charitable donations, several substantial gifts to causes Richard had supported throughout his life. Then came personal items: his watch to Michael, his mother's jewelry to the girls, his book collection to the local library. "Now," Mr. Caldwell continued, "we come to the matter of the primary estate." This was it. I braced myself for the polite but minimal provision Richard had likely made for me, enough to keep me comfortable perhaps, but nothing that would upset his children's expectations. "The house and its contents," Mr. Caldwell read, "I leave to my beloved wife, Elena, along with—" "Wait," Sarah interrupted. "The house, our family home, goes to her?" Mr. Caldwell looked over his glasses at her. "Please allow me to finish. Along with the sum of $200,000 and my personal investment portfolio, valued at approximately $1.2 million. The silence in the room was deafening. I felt dizzy. Richard had left me nearly $1.5 million. It was generous beyond anything I'd expected, certainly enough to make his children angry. Michael found his voice first. "What about the business, Dad's company?" "The business and its associated assets," Mr. Caldwell continued calmly, "valued at approximately $8 million, is to be divided equally among Sarah, Michael, and Jessica." The tension in the room relaxed slightly. $8 million split three ways was still a substantial inheritance, even after my unexpected windfall. "However," Mr. Caldwell said, and that single word made everyone freeze again, "there is one additional bequest that Richard was very specific about." He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a sealed envelope. My name was written across it in Richard's familiar handwriting. "Elena, your husband left this for you with very specific instructions. It was to be given to you only in the presence of his children, and only after the primary will had been read." My hands were shaking as I took the envelope. Sarah, Michael, and Jessica watched me with expressions ranging from suspicious to hostile. Whatever was in this envelope, Richard had wanted them to witness my receiving it. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and what looked like an old business card. I recognized the letterhead. It was from Richard's personal stationery, the kind he used for important correspondence. The letter was brief. "Fame, dearest Elena, *Faye, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are sitting in that law office surrounded by people who never understood what you meant to me. I hope that in the 4 years we had together, I showed you how much I loved you. You brought light back into my life when I thought I would spend my remaining years in darkness. *Faye, you never asked me for anything, not once. You never demanded jewelry or trips or access to my accounts. You never complained when my children treated you poorly. And you never asked me to choose between you and them. Your grace in the face of their rejection only made me love you more. *Faye, what you don't know is that I've been planning for this day since my first heart attack. I've been working with someone very special to ensure that you would be taken care of in a way that reflects not just my love for you, but my respect for the strength you've shown. *Faye, look at the business card in this envelope. Call the number. Ask for David Chen. Tell him you are ready to discuss the Harrison Foundation. Faye, I love you, Elena. You were never the gold digger they thought you were, but after today, you'll have all the gold you could ever need. Faye, forever yours. Richard Faye. My heart was pounding as I looked at the business card. It was simple, elegant. David Chen, estate planning attorney, Harrison and Associates. I looked up to find 6 pairs of eyes staring at me. Mr. Caldwell's expression was unreadable, but Sarah, Michael, and Jessica looked like they wanted to snatch the letter from my hands. What does it say? Sarah demanded. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope, along with the business card. It is personal. Everything about our father's estate is our business. Michael said firmly. What foundation? What is he talking about? Mr. Caldwell cleared his throat. I am afraid that is all the information I have regarding your father's will. If there are other matters he arranged separately, they would be handled by different counsel. Jessica stood up abruptly. This is ridiculous. Dad was clearly not thinking straight after his heart attack. No sane person leaves the family home to his wife? I said quietly. Finding my voice, to the person he chose to spend his final years with. You were with him for 4 years. Sarah spat. We were his children for our entire lives. And you'll inherit his business, I replied. $8 million split 3 ways. That is not exactly being left out in the cold. That is not the point, Michael said, his voice rising. This house has been in our family for 20 years. Mom chose every piece of furniture, planned every room, and now it is mine, I said, surprising myself with my firmness. According to your father's will, legally and clearly expressed. The meeting ended badly. The 3 siblings stormed out, whispering furiously among themselves. I stayed behind to sign some paperwork with Mr. Caldwell, who was professional, but clearly uncomfortable with the family drama he'd witnessed. Mrs. Harrison, he said as I prepared to leave, might I offer some advice? Of course. Be prepared for them to contest the will. They have the resources to make things difficult, and emotions are running high. He was right to warn me. Over the next 2 weeks, I received a series of increasingly hostile phone calls and text messages. Sarah hired a lawyer to investigate irregularities in their father's will. Michael had a locksmith come to the house, claiming he had a right to retrieve family heirlooms. Jessica showed up at my door drunk one night, screaming about how I had manipulated their grieving father. I was beginning to understand why Richard had been so secretive about his planning. He'd known this would happen. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I called the number on David Chen's business card. Harrison and Associates, David Chen's office. Hello, I am Elena Harrison, Richard Harrison's widow. He left me a note saying I should call about something called the Harrison Foundation. There was a pause. Mrs. Harrison, we've been expecting your call. Mr. Chen has been waiting to hear from you. Can you come in tomorrow morning? Say 10 o'clock. The law offices of Harrison and Associates were in downtown, occupying an entire floor of a gleaming skyscraper. David Chen was a serious-looking man in his 40s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Mrs. Harrison, he said, rising to greet me. First, please accept my condolences on Richard's passing. He was a remarkable man and a very thoughtful client. Thank you. I have to admit, I am confused about why I am here. Richard's will was already read, and Richard's will covered his personal estate, David explained, gesturing for me to sit. What we're here to discuss today is something entirely different, something much larger. He opened a thick file on his desk. Tell me, what do you know about the Harrison Foundation? Nothing, I admitted. Richard never mentioned it. David smiled. He wanted it to be a surprise. Elena, your husband was a very private man when it came to his charitable activities. Over the past 15 years, since his first wife's death, he established a private foundation dedicated to supporting women's causes, domestic violence shelters, educational scholarships, job training programs. I had no idea. He didn't publicize it. The foundation was funded through a separate business entity he created, something completely independent from his main company. He'd been moving assets into it gradually for years. My head was spinning. I don't understand. What does this have to do with me? David leaned forward. Elena, as of today, You are the sole trustee and director of the Harrison Foundation. You control assets worth approximately $32 million. The room seemed to tilt. 32 million? Richard spent the months after his first heart attack restructuring everything. He moved the bulk of his wealth, the real wealth, not just the business he was leaving to his children, into the foundation. He designated you as his successor. But why? We never talked about charity work or foundations or... Because, David said gently, he watched how you handled his children's treatment of you. He saw your grace under pressure. He knew that someone who could endure what you endured, without bitterness or revenge, was someone who could be trusted with the power to help other people. I sat in stunned silence as David explained the scope of the foundation, the main office building, worth 12 million, investment portfolios worth 15 million, real estate holdings worth another 5 million. It was an empire of generosity that Richard had built in secret. What about his children? I asked. Do they know? They know the foundation exists, but they have no idea of its size or that you now control it. Richard was very specific about that. He said they would try to interfere if they knew the true scope of what he was leaving to you. That evening, I sat in Richard's study, my study now, staring at the documents David had given me, bank statements showing accounts I never knew existed, property deeds for buildings I'd never heard of, investment reports detailing a portfolio that made me one of the wealthiest women in the state. But more than the money, I was overwhelmed by the trust Richard had placed in me. He'd watched me endure his children's hostility for 4 years, and instead of seeing weakness, he'd seen strength. Instead of seeing someone to be pitied, he'd seen someone to be empowered. 3 weeks later, Sarah called to gloat. Their lawyer had found what they thought was a technicality in Richard's will, and they were confident they could get my inheritance reduced significantly. We're not greedy, Elena, she said, in that patronizing tone she'd perfected over the years. We just want what is fair. You can keep some money, of course, maybe even the house if you really want it, but Dad's main assets need to come back to the family. I see, I said calmly. Our lawyer thinks we can settle this quickly if you are reasonable. We could have this wrapped up in a month or 2. Actually, Sarah, I think there might be a misunderstanding about what your father's main assets were. There was a pause. What do you mean? Why don't you, Michael and Jessica, come by the house tomorrow evening, around 7? I think it is time we had a real conversation about your father's estate. The next evening, I watched from the living room window as the 3 siblings walked up the front steps together. They moved like a pack, unified in their purpose to reclaim what they saw as rightfully theirs. I answered the door wearing one of the elegant dresses Richard had loved to see me in, my hair styled professionally, my makeup perfect. I looked like the wife of a wealthy man, which, I realized, was exactly what I was. Come in, I said pleasantly. Can I offer you anything to drink? They declined and followed me into the living room, where I had arranged 4 chairs in a circle. On the coffee table, I had placed a single folder. Elena, Sarah began, we appreciate you agreeing to discuss this reasonably. Actually, I interrupted gently, I asked you here to discuss something that I think will interest you. It is about the Harrison Foundation. Michael frowned. Dad's little charity thing. What about it? Well, I said, opening the folder and removing a document. It turns out it wasn't so little after all. I placed the foundation's asset summary on the coffee table where they could all see it. The total at the bottom was circled in red, $32,247,000. The silence stretched for nearly a minute. This is impossible, Jessica finally whispered. Your father spent 15 years building this foundation, I explained calmly. He funded it through a separate business entity, one that he never mentioned to you because he wanted his charitable work to be private. Sarah grabbed the document, scanning it frantically. These properties, these investments. Where did the money come from? From your father's real business success. You see, the company he left you, while valuable, was just one part of his empire. The foundation represents the majority of his actual wealth. Michael was staring at the numbers. $32 million in a foundation, yes, and as of last week, I am the sole trustee and director. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. You. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. You control $32 million? I control the charitable disbursement of $32 million. I corrected. It is not my personal money. It belongs to the women and families the foundation serves. This is insane, Michael said, jumping to his feet. Dad couldn't have. He could, and he did. I said, firmly. He left each of you nearly $3 million from the business. Most people would consider that a generous inheritance. But this. Jessica gestured wildly at the document. This is everything. This is the real money. I stood up slowly, feeling calmer and more confident than I had in years. Yes, it is, and he left it to me because he trusted me to use it well. Sarah's face was red with rage. Trusted you. You are nobody. You were married to him for 4 years. We're his children. You are his children who made it clear that I was never part of your family, I said quietly. You are his children who couldn't even include me in his funeral eulogy. You are his children who spent 4 years treating me like an unwelcome stranger in my own home. You don't deserve this, Michael said, his voice shaking. Maybe not, I agreed. But it is what your father wanted, and unlike his business, which you can inherit automatically, this foundation requires someone who actually cares about helping others. I walked to the window, looking out at the garden Richard and I had planted together. Your father watched me for 4 years. He saw how I treated you despite how you treated me. He saw that I never asked him for money or gifts or special treatment. He saw that I loved him for who he was, not what he had. I turned back to face them, and he saw that someone who could endure that kind of treatment without becoming bitter might be exactly the right person to help other women who are going through difficult times. Jessica was crying now. It is not fair. He was our father first. You are right, I said softly. He was your father first, but I was his choice last, and apparently, that matters too. The next few months were difficult. The siblings hired a team of lawyers to challenge the foundation's structure, but Richard had been thorough. Everything was legal, properly documented, and unbreachable. As the reality of the situation sank in, their anger gradually transformed into something else. A grudging realization that their father had outmaneuvered them completely. He'd given them what they expected while secretly ensuring that his true legacy would be managed by someone he trusted. Sarah was the first to reach out, 6 months after that confrontation in the living room. She called to tell me that she'd been thinking about some of the women's shelters in the area, and wondered if the foundation might be interested in funding a new program. It was a small gesture, but it was something Michael took longer to come around. But eventually he approached me about a job training program. His company could partner with the foundation on. Jessica surprised me the most. She started volunteering at one of the shelters the foundation supported, and one day she called to say she finally understood why her father had chosen me. You never fought back, she said. We were horrible to you for 4 years, and you never once tried to turn Dad against us. You never once made him choose. I loved him too much to put him in that position, I told her. That is what he saw, isn't it? That is why he trusted you with this. Today, 2 years later, the Harrison Foundation has grown to over $40 million in assets. We've opened 3 new women's shelters, funded dozens of educational scholarships, and helped hundreds of women start new careers. I still live in the house Richard and I shared, but it feels different now. It is not borrowed anymore, it is home. The garden we planned together is thriving, and I've added a small memorial bench where I sit sometimes in the evenings and tell him about the day's work. His children and I will never be close, but we've found a way to coexist respectfully. They understand now that their father's final gift wasn't about money. It was about trust. He trusted them to run his business successfully, and he trusted me to carry on his commitment to helping others. Sometimes people ask me if I feel guilty about inheriting so much when I was only Richard's second wife. The question used to bother me, but it doesn't anymore. I wasn't Richard's first choice. Margaret was, and she was perfect for the first part of his life, but I was his choice for the second part, and apparently, I was exactly what he needed when he needed it most. The woman who was thrown out of her own home after her husband's funeral turned out to be the same woman who would become one of the state's largest charitable donors. Richard saw that potential in me when I couldn't even see it myself. He taught me that sometimes the people who underestimate you are doing you the biggest favor of all. They're clearing the way for you to surprise everyone, including yourself. My stepchildren thought they were getting rid of the gold digger who had stolen their inheritance. What they actually did was unleash the philanthropist their father had been secretly preparing for 15 years. And honestly, I think Richard would be proud of the irony.